Okay, let's talk Core to Stars. I think that I released a video on Core to Stars yesterday, just uploading a run in the dungeon, but I didn't. I wanted to actually stop and take a second and give some commentary and maybe some feedback and some talking points on the things that I thought were good about Court and the things that I thought could improve about Court. I think that this the title of this video is going to be overtly negative. But I think that in general, and I'm going to talk about this at the end, those aren't necessarily my thoughts specifically about the whole dungeon. But there are a couple of glaring issues that we saw in Court of Stars that have honestly always been present in the dungeon. It's nothing that's new if you've played the dungeon before. But I think that I want to talk about some of the mistakes that are currently being made with Court of Stars and maybe some of the things that should be addressed before this dungeon gets pushed forward as a Dragonflight M+ dungeon. So we tested Court of Stars on beta this most recent weekend, and there were definitely, I would say first and foremost, I noticed that the dungeon was undertuned. I think that this is easily fixable. It just ended up coming off like there were a lot of mobs that it felt like the dungeon was like 2 or 3 key levels below where other dungeons were, at least on like the 15 to 16 level. It felt like this dungeon was like turbo free, and it was one of those keys that if you hit it, you were going to be able to do it at like multiple key levels higher. That was the first impression of it. I don't think that really matters. That's something that absolutely can get fixed with just some general tuning to the dungeon. That's like it's an M+ beta. It's the Dragonflight beta. I suspect that this is going to mostly be fixed. Now, the big thing that I was actually kind of surprised about was that the profession buffs were still in a similar state as they were back in Legion. So for those who don't know, the Court of Stars actually has a bunch of buffs in this courtyard area that are either gated behind race, class, or professions. And they're very powerful buffs. The big asterisk on these buffs that are powerful are that there are only so many of them available per run, and the ones that you're getting are random. And so you cannot pre-plan which buffs you're going to be selecting before the run starts. You don't know which buffs are going to be available to activate as well. And I kind of talked about this in a video a couple months back, and I kind of hoped that Blizzard was going to change how the profession buffs work. I was unfortunately surprised that they didn't change them. I thought that this was going to be something that like Blizzard has been straying away from like mass amounts of RNG in dungeons for a little bit now, and I was actually rather surprised that they elected to keep the dungeon buffs the way they were. And so you may not know what the dungeon buffs are. Let's kind of go through like what they are and then like why these dungeon buffs are just generally problematic. There's the Anima Power Conduit, which is colloquially known as the NG Orb, and it deactivates the Guardian Constructs, which are like Lieutenant Mob-esque. I don't want to say they're Lieutenant Mobs, but they're high count mobs that are in the dungeon, and then it turns them into neutral mobs, literally making them not do anything and stunning them permanently. Flask of the Solemn Night, it kills off the first boss whenever he walks up to there. He walks up at like 20%, so you're able to save 20% of the boss's HP. Bizarre Goods, things like that will allow you to activate the Enforcers in advance. The life-size Nightborn statue also allows you to activate and like skip an Enforcer in advance and just summon one of the mini bosses from the Flame Wreath encounter. The discarded junk will actually end up summoning and killing one of the mini bosses. So obviously you're already seeing a lot of there's no parity between these buffs. One of these buffs summons the ad. The other buff summons the ad and kills the ad. Like, okay, so this is, I don't know, 45 seconds, and you actually lose some count for this. Whereas this is, I don't know, a minute and a half saved, and so you're already starting to see the lack of parity. A Wounded Nightborn Civilian, which again summons one of the Enforcers. The Fell Orb, which gives you 10% crit chance. The Infernal Tome, which gives you 10% DR. The Lantern, which increases all of your damage by a flat 10%. Nightshade Refreshments, which gives you 25% maximum HP. Starlight Rose Brew, which gives you 3% health per 3 seconds and 2% mana per 3 seconds. Umbral Bloom, which gives you 10% haste. And then the Waterlogged Scroll, which gives you 30% movement speed. And so, as you can probably see, these things are starting to become problematic, especially whenever they are randomly selected. In addition to that, you don't necessarily know which buffs you're going to be able to activate in advance, and there are things that are super powerful, as you can obviously tell. So, for example, the Brew and the food buff historically in combination with one another were incredibly powerful, especially back in Legion. This is honestly still kind of the case, and that's one of the big issues with the dungeon. And so the brew is only activatable by monks and DKs, which you'd be like, oh, okay, this is a good way to also bring monks and DKs to this dungeon. But at the same point, this engineering orb is activated by goblins, gnomes, or engineers. And so you're thinking, oh yeah. Engineers are fine. Like you can force professions onto players just to be able to do Court of Stars. I mean, yes, but that kind of sucks with the revamp of the profession system, right? Especially whenever players are going to care a lot more about their professions. Having these buffs either gated behind professions, race, class, and then on top of all of that, being random. So say you didn't have a large, diverse pool of professions, and then on top of that, say you had like 2 druids in your group or 2 priests in your group, something like that, and then you didn't really have a diverse pool of classes either. There are times where there are only like 4 or 5 buffs in the whole entire dungeon, and you are only able to get like 2 of them, and that feels super bad. Like, and I think that that's a major issue with Court of Stars just in general. I mean, in addition to that, like the buffs are, how do I say this? The buffs are just too powerful in general, and there is no parity between the buffs themselves. I think maybe if the buffs' relative power was tuned down, it would be more or less fine. But then you look at the problem points of the dungeon, and the problem points, I'm going to try to speed through this VOD a little bit so I can actually talk over while we're fighting the boss. The problem points in this dungeon are and kind of have always been the final 2 bosses in Tettles, Flame Wreath, and Advisor Melandris. And so, I mean, you're going to see us blast this boss on this level. It's a 16 fortified. I still think this dungeon is a little bit undertuned relative to like equitable dungeon levels, but the hard parts of this dungeon are always Tettles, Flame Wreath, and Advisor Melandris, and the timer is not overly tight. And so say you get something like the Engineering Orb, which the Engineering Orb, deactivating all the constructs, effectively gives you somewhere in the order of like 20% count for free by completely making these very dangerous, annoying mobs that you otherwise would not be able to pull together, these Guardian constructs, and instead they become actual target dummies, and you're able to get somewhere in the order of 20% count, which saves you, I don't know, probably 3 minutes by itself, maybe even more. On top of that, the Tettles, Flame Wreath encounter and Advisor Melandris encounter that I keep talking about are the big choke points in this dungeon. And so having things like 25% additional maximum HP, or a 10% DR scroll, or the brew, which is giving you 3% maximum HP every 3 seconds, those things are very important as well. And so this creates like a massive disparity between, especially at the upper end, but even starting to get even towards the lower end of, okay, I've zoned into the key. I don't know if I'm going to be able to have like this plus or minus 5 minutes relative to the buffs that I have. And again, like I said, on top of that, if you just don't have the buffs available to you, that's a problem in and of itself inside of Court of Stars. So these are the major issues that I see with Court. Otherwise, which is kind of funny because I'm about to give praises to Court. It's a fun dungeon. I actually found it a lot of fun to play. I enjoyed it a lot, even though it was kind of undertuned. I think that the dungeon is well designed just in general and has a lot of polish to it. I think that the professions are still just super problematic. I actually think that Tettles, Flame Wreath, and Advisor Melandris being the big choke points of the dungeon, being the hard, you need to play super safe on these 2 fights, make sure that you are playing well on these 2 encounters, those 2 things being the hard points of the dungeon are more or less fine in my mind. But there comes a problem whenever you are relying specifically on buffs to speed up your dungeon, and on top of that, there's also a chance where you get like no buffs that you're able to activate because either players don't want, and they shouldn't have to, by the way, change their professions just for one specific dungeon in the dungeon pool, or you're not able to play with your friends because, like, we saw this with Covenant specific buffs already. Like, we saw how this played out. You ended up being like, oh yeah, I'm looking for a Night Fae Druid. All right, cool. Or like a Night Fae whatever. Night Fae Lust class was, I guess, probably the most popular one whenever you're looking at LFG. And now you're only going to accept players that have either like a specific profession and a specific class sometimes, and that just feels really bad because more often than not you would rather play with like your friends, but then it's like, oh, okay, sorry, we can't play with like this double whatever class comp because you guys aren't going to have a wide enough range of class buffs and you're going to be doing the dungeon super inefficiently. I think that one of the biggest things that I've seen is that players don't want to feel artificially constrained buy random stuff inside of dungeons, whether that be dungeon buffs, lowering their ability to be able to do the dungeon, or whether that be like just feeling artificially constrained before you even zone into the dungeon. I mean, we talked about like gearing at times as well. Like M plus only players don't want to feel like constrained by gear that they can't achieve outside of M plus. Like they don't want to feel like they are forced to go and do raid for the gear. Kind of the same thing inside of Quarter Stars buffs. They don't want to feel like they're playing at a massive disadvantage before you even step in. And I mean, we even see this in Arena with arena gearing, and they talk about it all the time. They don't even want to do PvP before their characters are like max level geared. And it's kind of the same thing with dungeons. It's kind of the same thing with Quarter Stars. It was the same thing with Covenant buffs. Why zone in if I'm going to be playing at like a multiple minute loss before the dungeon even starts? All right, that's the end of my rant. Overall, I think Quarter Stars is a great dungeon. It has a lot of polish. I had a lot of fun playing it. I think it's actually ranking super highly, like in regards to how I feel about dungeons. I'm going to try to release a tier list once I am able to test Temple of the Jade Serpent and kind of get a good feel for what I think about Temple of the Jade Serpent. And so I think I'm going to release a tier list talking about like, oh, how I feel about all of the dungeons, kind of ranking them as well. I'm getting like a cohesive ranking before the expansion launches and just kind of give a little bit of feedback. Maybe some stuff could get changed between now and expansion launch. But overall, these are my thoughts on Quarter Stars. I hope some stuff gets changed. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.